What's going on, adventurers? My name's Travis and welcome back to another project. Today we're going to be finishing this Kegerator cabinet my wife and I built in a beautiful distressed wood finish. If you haven't seen our last video, we built this Kegerator cabinet at home from parts we purchased at our local hardware store. I'll post a card in the video here. You can click over, check out the build. It's a really cool build, and then come right back here and we'll show you how we're going to finish this thing off. So what is distressed wood? I actually just learned there was a specific term for this the other day. I always knew it as weathering something or just making something look old. But the term is distressed wood, so basically you're intentionally trying to make something look aged. There are many different ways to achieve this look. Some are more artistic, some are more basic, so it really depends on the look you're going for and how deep you want to dive into this. The way we're going to achieve this look is with products we purchased at our local Home Depot. First, we're going to coat the entire cabinet in this dark brown varathane stain. This will end up being the final color for our tabletop. For the rest of the cabinet, we'll coat the entire cabinet in this heavy white chalk paint. So this is just a heavy paint that will go on over the stain, and then we'll do some finishing work to really bring out that weathered look. So thanks for joining us. We'll get right into this distressed wood Kegerator cabinet. So before we get into any staining or painting, we have to do a little prep work and give this cabinet some character. We built this Kegerator cabinet to have a nice rustic look, but with all the factory edges on the wood, nice straight lines and undamaged faces, it still looks really new. So this is where you get to have a little fun with this project. We get to artificially make it look like this cabinet has faced decades of use and abuse. So to get a nice authentic look on this piece, you have to think a little bit about how your piece of furniture is going to be used and the damage that it could face over the years to come. Since this is going to be a home bar, we're considering the use and abuse that a regular bar would face in everyday life. So I'm picturing for this tabletop the kind of tabletop you could see in an old dive bar. It's been around for decades. It's still the hardwood original top on the bar. So when we consider the kind of finish a bar tabletop is going to have, it's going to be smoothed out from years of people leaning on it, rubbing their elbows on it, you know, dents and dings and scratches from beer glasses and people picking at things. The rest of the Kegerator cabinet would usually face, you know, chairs being banged into it, edges being chipped, corners being rounded off. So this is where I'm going to get a little creative with this process, find some different tools and objects to really give this Kegerator cabinet some character. So I'm going to start with the countertop on this cabinet. So I looked around the garage and found a couple different items. Gonna see if I can find a few more, but I've got this punch set here. It's got a lot of different shapes that we can dig into the countertop. I've got this pop can here. Gonna see if I can hit it with a hammer and get some ring marks and everything into the countertop, as well as just some different items, knives, keys, just wear and tear that a countertop would face over years of use. So I'm just taking some of the different shapes from this punch set and just going over the tabletop, putting dings, dents, scuffs in it, just things that you'd normally see from dropped objects. So the box cutting knife, I'm just going along and just cutting these little V grooves in the wood. As you cut into it, it makes a pretty good gouge into it, and it just looks like you really dug into it with something. Just going along some of the raised edges in the joins of the wood and just taking off little chunks here and there. Just kind of shows that it's rounded out a little bit. So I've got quite a few dents, dings, and scratches in the tabletop now. I'm just gonna go over it with this orbital sander. So this will just smooth out some of those clean lines, round off some of the corners and different things like that, as well as there's a couple stamps from the milling process still on there. So we'll get that all cleaned up, see where we're at. We might have to add a little bit more afterwards. So I'm going to use this Dremel with a sanding wheel on it and just sand out some of these rougher divots here just to smooth them out a bit. I'm pretty happy with the way the tabletop turned out. I rounded off a lot of the sharp edges and scratched and scuffed a lot of character into the tops. Moving on to the cabinet now, we're gonna do a very similar thing. We're gonna round off a lot of the edges. We might not impact as many scuffs and scratches into the faces of stuff, but we're gonna focus more on the corners because that's where a lot of damage is gonna be done over the years. So we're gonna take off a lot of those corners, put some nice big dents and divots in there, just give it a lot of character. Now that I've added some character to the cabinet, using the Dremel along the edges, I'm gonna disassemble the doors, take them off, and then work on them a little bit more. That'll make it a little easier to get into those hard to reach places, as well as when we go to stain it, it'll be a lot easier. Now that I got all the hardware off the door, I'm gonna go over some of those hard to reach areas. Places like where the handle is, that's going to see more wear and tear. There might be a bit of a divot there, so I'm going to sand in a bit of a divot underneath the handle there and just touch up some of these spots and then sand the entire door. So the doors are all sanded off now, so I'm just going to take the orbital sander and just go over all the pieces, smooth them out, get them prepped for stain. I sanded down the doors with the orbital sander, as well as used the Dremel to round off the corners and some of the edges and put some divots in, just to give it a little more character. Now I'm just gonna get the shop vac, clean up all this dust, get the drop cloth down, and then start staining this thing. I'm going to stain the entire cabinet and then use the cabinet as a workbench to stain the tabletop and the doors and hopefully get it all done in one coat. Looking really good. It looks pretty dark in the video here, but it's a dark brown, and then once we cover it up in that chalk paint, once we sand through, it'll really show through it. Well, I had enough stain to do the entire outside of the cabinets, both sides of the doors, as well as both sides of the tabletop. I was running pretty low, so I wasn't able to do the interior of the cabinet, but you gotta remember, we're gonna be covering all of this over with white paint, and then when we sand it, some of that dark stain will show through. So all the parts that we're going to sand and are gonna show are all stained now. So I'm gonna let it sit for a good long dry time. The stain calls for an hour, but I'm gonna give it a few more hours than that. Since we're painting over it with a white paint, if there's any wet spots, it's just gonna get all mixed in with that white paint and just make a complete mess. So we're gonna let it dry all out and then start covering the rest of the cabinet with the white chalk paint. So I left the stain overnight to dry. Checking on it this morning, it was still looking a little tacky, so I decided to give it a test run with one of the doors, try putting on some paint. It's going on nice and clean, so we're gonna start with our paint. I'm just putting the second coat of paint on the cabinet doors here. And if you're like me and you have a bad habit of painting in these short brush strokes, you might be having a tough time getting the right finish that you're looking for. So what you can do when you want to get a nice finish on these kind of projects is Once you have a section completely covered, you can use a technique called tipping. So you use the tip of the paintbrush and then you just run it down the length of the piece you just painted. So what that does is it just puts nice straight lines in it and just gets rid of all those little brush strokes. Our chalk paint is finally dry. Now we get to start the most exciting part of this process and really make this cabinet come alive. We're gonna use sandpaper to sand through portions of the white paint so that the dark stain shows through and it looks like there's wear on this cabinet. I'm gonna be using this sanding block here. I've got some 120 grit sandpaper on it. I might go down to 80 grit for certain portions of it. If you don't have a sanding block, no worries, you don't need one. You can just use sandpaper on its own. Sanding block just makes it a little easier on the flat areas and gives you a little more control. If you want to make one of these at home, if you just find a block of 2x4 or any scrap wood you have laying around, tape your sandpaper onto it, it works just the same. You really want to focus on the areas that would see the most wear, such as corners and the straight edges. So we're going to use our sandpaper to sand through that, show some of that dark stain through, and that will make it look very worn. On the flat portions of the cabinet, we're going to sand through strategically in portions just to have some uneven wear on the paint. I can't stress this enough. When you're doing this process, take your time. If you sand too much or too fast, the only option you have is to repaint your cabinet. It's always easier to take more off than try and add on. That being said, if you sand a little bit too much in an area and sand through, or it's a little uneven, all wear on furniture is always going to be different. So you know what? It's not a mistake. It's just extra wear. These large flat areas, I'm using 80 grit sandpaper, so you have to be really careful with this. It's pretty aggressive, so you just want to take your time. I'm just kind of sporadically going along, and you can see as I pass over top of these high areas, it just kind of starts stripping away a little bit of that white paint and showing that dark stain through here. So I'm barely holding on to this. I'm just using basically just the weight of it. And you don't want to do too much. You just want to take your time. If you're anxious about starting to sand your paint, give yourself a break. Start on the back side of a door like I'm doing, or somewhere that's a little hidden, so if you make a few mistakes in the beginning, they're easy to correct. But here's a close-up, so I'm just lightly grabbing this, and you can see as I'm sanding here, just a couple passes, and it's already starting to come out. So it doesn't take much. You can see each time I pass, it's slowly going through here. And really, that's all it takes. Just light pressure on the sanding block here, sanding through, and this portion's looking really good. So I'm gonna try and get this look on the rest of the doors here. I finished sanding the faces of all the doors. They're starting to look really good. Some of that wood grain is coming through and some of that darker stain. I'm gonna switch to a higher grit sandpaper now and sand the edges of the doors and the corners. The reason I'm using a higher grit sandpaper than 80 grit is 80 grit just seems to cut through the paint a little too quick for what I'm liking. So with the higher grit, it'll take a little bit less off with each pass, and then I can just sand through that white paint layer and get into that dark stain. As you remember, before we painted and stained, we used the sandpaper and Dremel to put some divots into the wood, give it a little bit of character. So as I'm sanding here, I'm gonna get into all those little divots and sand out the paint. The idea being, on a piece of furniture, if you take a divot out of it or bang into it, most likely the paint's gonna chip away and it'll just make this wear look very authentic. After sanding, I went over the entire cabinet and the doors with a shop vac, just cleaning up all that loose dust from sanding, as well as I went over it with this tack rag. So these are like a couple bucks anywhere you can buy automotive paint or anything like that. They're just a really sticky, tacky rag, so you just tap it over top of your finished project. It'll pull all that little fine dust out and make a really nice clean surface. So now that we've spent all this time trying to beat up our cabinet, make it look old and weathered, we want to start thinking about protecting it, which seems a little funny, but hey, it's worth it. So I've got this chalk paint protective top coat. So this is just a matte clear. So once we put it on and it dries, you shouldn't be able to see it. It says that it enhances that matte finish of the chalk paint, then as well as it protects the surface. So just from further scratching, if we're banging into it, we don't gouge out a bunch of that paint and get right down to that bare pine wood that wouldn't match it. We finished off the tabletop in much the same way as the rest of the cabinet. As you recall, we left the tabletop in that dark stain finish. We went over the entire tabletop with 220 grit sandpaper that just smoothed it out a little bit, sanded through that stain a little, and showed that wood grain through. After cleaning up the tabletop with a shop vac and tack rag, we went over it with 3 coats of polyurethane high gloss coating. Now if you're worried about getting a mirror-like finish, you can sand in between each coat. Since the tabletop we have has quite a bit of a bumpy texture, we didn't, and it turned out really nice. Now the only thing left to do is bring this cabinet inside, put it back together, and show you the finished product. Well, our Kegerator cabinet is all back together and it looks amazing. I had high hopes for the distressed finish on our cabinet, but the final product surpassed all my expectations. The matte clear coat on the cabinet that we put on just really brought the piece together. It's hard to put your finger on it, but it just has a really clean look to it. Almost looks like it's manufactured that way. The dark tabletop with the wood grain and the high gloss coating looks fantastic. The more you look at it, the more detail comes out, and it just adds a lot of nice contrast with the rest of the white cabinet. To attach the tabletop to the rest of the cabinet, I used a piece of piano hinge that'll just allow a little more access once we do put our Kegerator into this cabinet. So I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I did making this project. Hopefully we gave you a couple ideas for your own furniture projects. It's a really cool, easy way to liven up your furniture, give it a very unique look that your friends and family will be amazed at. They'll be amazed that you did this all yourself. In our next video, it'll be the final one of this series. We're gonna be converting our Danby mini fridge over into our Kegerator, installing it in the cabinet, and we'll be able to have beer on tap right here in the kitchen. If you have any questions, please comment below. And remember to like and subscribe. We really appreciate the support, and we hope to see you back here again to finish off this Kegerator cabinet.